Hello and welcome to Clear Politics. The story with a Chinese weather balloon over the United States has become a real Hollywood epic with a touch of comedy. For us, this is a great occasion to recall the most notorious stories involving aerospace incidents, which weren't always harmless. Schemes, customers and goals, victims and consequences of intelligence operations right now. Air provocations and aerial reconnaissance are by no means a new thing. The confrontation of the superpowers has always been accompanied by a desire to dig up each other's secrets. The topic of balloons in the sky over the US has been relevant for almost 80 years. At the same time, the balloons weren't always foreign-made. As a rule, they were raised into the sky by local engineers as part of spying on the USSR. One example is the Mogul project, carried out under the supervision of Columbia University professor Maurice Ewing. It was a top-secret US Air Force operation involving the use of microphones on high-altitude balloons, the primary purpose of which was to detect long-range sound waves from the Soviet atomic bomb tests. It was implemented in the period from 1947 until early 1949. In the summer of 1947, a Mogul project balloon crashed in a desert near Roswell in New Mexico. There were also two other similar projects as part of Moby Dick and Genetrix projects. From early January to early February 1956, over 500 high-altitude aircraft were launched from sites in Western Europe, Turkey and the USA. The global spy operation was aimed mainly at compiling detailed geographical maps and determining the military potential of the USSR.
You need to understand that in that era, when numerous aircraft were launched for espionage, it was still a period before the development of the entire satellite system. Now there are satellites with high-precision instruments that allow you to take pictures outside stratosphere just in the airspace of a particular country. Of course, this doesn't mean that NATO countries don't use reconnaissance aircraft. Of course they do. And we're seeing this particular activity in the Black Sea and around Ukraine. There's a certain emphasis on this, but there is simply no need to rely only on this nowadays.
The espionage activities of the US intelligence goes beyond balloons. The high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft U-2 is rightfully considered the pride of Western designers. For a long time it was the all-seeing eye of the Pentagon and was completely invulnerable to air defense. The 34th President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, considered this aircraft to be his brainchild. Lockheed's U-2 was a high-performance aircraft with the capacity to fly long distances at high altitudes. It was possible thanks to a special engine and a successful design. The plane used special fuel. Its wing had a design which made it possible to increase the flight range. On the 1st of May 1960, a U-2 aircraft took off from the airfield in Peshawar, piloted by Gary Powers. His tasks included flying over Soviet nuclear facilities. The route ran through Chelyabinsk, Yekaterinburg and Novgorod region, where Arzamas-16 was being built at the time. Then the Kirov and Arkhangelsk regions, where the Plesetsk Cosmodrome was being built. Then the Murmansk region, where a naval base was located. And then he was to land in Norway at a NATO base. Estimated flight time was about 9 hours. However, on approaching Sverdlovsk, the U-2 came under fire from Soviet anti-aircraft missiles, one of which hit the aircraft.
I looked up looked out, and just everything was orange, everywhere. I don't know whether it was the reflection in the canopy of the aircraft itself or just the whole sky. And I can remember saying to myself, by God, I've had it now.
Powers landed by parachute in the Sverdlovsk region. According to the instructions, he was to use a poisoned pin and commit suicide to keep secret information safe. The young pilot couldn't do it and forever fell out of favor in his own homeland. The United States denied that the incident with the reconnaissance aircraft really happened and snickered at Soviet spy mania. But then the wreckage of the plane was put on display in a square near the Bolshoi Theater, and Powers was publicly tried.
This, of course, led to a large-scale diplomatic scandal, even freezing relations between the US and the USSR for some time. But the incident involved a manned aircraft and the pilot was caught, arrested, convicted, and then exchanged a few years later for a Soviet intelligence officer who was arrested in the United States.
Many believe that Eisenhower was one-upped and Powers was shot down due to an incident that happened 2 years earlier. A US Air Force Douglas C-118 aircraft violated Soviet airspace and was forced to land at a Soviet airfield. On board, there were 3 CIA officers, 6 officers and soldiers of the US Army. They were transporting secret documents containing information about U-2 flights over the Soviet Union. After returning to their homeland, the crew claimed they were able to eat and destroy the entire package of documents. But after some time, the newest Soviet Desna S-75 anti-aircraft systems suddenly were able to shoot down Powers. Aircraft have always played a leading role in the intelligence service. Such tricks as collecting important information on foreign territory under a random guise were practiced by Germany even before the Second World War.
This kind of thing was done by the Nazis in 1940-1941 when Lufthansa aircraft with passengers were used to collect intelligence about the Soviet Union when preparations for the Great Patriotic War were underway. By the way, in Germany this war is called the War to Destroy the USSR. Modern German historians call it that. And subsequently, the Nazi experience was adopted, I believe, by the Americans and the Western intelligence services.
The mystery of the South Korean Boeing is how the journalists dubbed this story. In April 1978, a passenger plane that was flying from France to South Korea suddenly changed course and invaded the airspace of the USSR near the Kola Peninsula. Fighters were sent to intercept it. The Boeing refused to obey and tried to escape across the Finnish border. During the interrogation, the pilot stated that their navigation equipment had failed and they'd lost their bearings. At the same time, they saw Soviet fighters and heard their commands but ignored them. However, having been deported, they suddenly changed their story. A few years later, the crew's captain, who was a military pilot in the past, died under strange circumstances in a car accident. Missiles were fired at the Boeing. The multi-ton aircraft literally landed on one wing on a frozen lake. The passengers were evacuated. Only 2 people died. Whether it was an accident or a provocation is still up for debate. But too many coincidences speak in favor of the fact that the plane flew into Soviet territory for a reason, and the flight most likely was a reconnaissance operation.
At that time, large-scale military exercises of the Soviet Army, both the Air Force and the Navy, were held there, i.e. a lot of valuable information: how air defense systems work, how aviation works, how the Navy works. Photographs were taken from an American satellite and a reconnaissance aircraft. Other reconnaissance means were involved, which were found in Norway, Sweden, etc. That is, intelligence was being collected. When an aircraft violates a border and approaches military facilities, additional air defense systems are turned on, thereby revealing their deployment points. The intelligence records the frequencies and put on the map the places where the radars and anti-aircraft missile systems are located. This is reconnaissance by combat.
Only such reconnaissance operations use aircraft with civilians on board, and perhaps this is the worst part. The passengers serve as a living shield. All this is reminiscent of terrorists hiding behind hostages. But for the West, all is fair in a war.
The same thing happened in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. If we recall the events of the Great Patriotic War, on the eve of its start, in May 1941, the so-called overflights of German civil aviation were recorded throughout the entire territory of Belarus right up to Smolensk. The Nazi checked whether anti-aircraft systems were working or not. It's clear that when such aircraft fly over, special stations are simultaneously operating on the territory of neighboring countries to record information on our air defense systems and radars. And in case of a military operation, they plan to prioritize destroying these complexes with the help of NATO.
5 years later, in 1983, the phrase South Korean Boeing will become a symbol of the Cold War, and the cause for that will be a much more tragic story. A plane of the same airline was shot down over Sakhalin. 269 people were killed. According to TASS news agency, the aircraft flew without navigation lights, did not respond to requests, and didn't communicate with the ATC tower. The aircraft veered more than 300 kilometers off course and suddenly found itself flying over the Kamchatka Peninsula just north of the city itself. Soviet fighters were alerted and escorted the plane to the Soviet land borders. Soon, however, the plane again violated the Soviet air border over Sakhalin. The deviation now reached 500 kilometers, which was treated by the USSR military as a serious crime.
In this situation, Anatoly Kornikov, commander of the 48th Fighter Division in the Far East, gave the order to destroy the Boeing. In 1998-2002, he served as commander-in-chief of the Russian Air Force. Repeatedly talking about the most important decision of his life at that time, Kornikov always stressed that he based it on the norms of international and Soviet law, considering the flight of the Korean plane a provocation of the Americans.
Again, there are too many nuances. On the part of the West, of course, there was universal condemnation, but the tragedy took place during the acute phase of the Cold War, and provocations in the region had been recorded before that.
In the new realities, the US military significantly increased reconnaissance activity, regarded by the USSR as spying and therefore illegal in the Far East. Mutual provocations took place in the Sea of Okhotsk. The USA was especially interested in secret strategic targets in Kamchatka and Sakhalin. The situation was exacerbated by an incident on April 4th of the same year when 6 US attack aircraft violated Soviet border and flew several dozen kilometers in to conduct simulated bombing raids on Zelony Island in the vicinity of the Kuril Islands minor ridge. The Defense Ministry took that incident as a painful insult and reprimanded the commander of the local air defense system for not stopping the impertinent invaders.
A week later, with a pointer in his hand, the chief of the general staff was proving by his own and foreign journalists that the Korean Boeing was in fact not a civilian plane, but a reconnaissance aircraft.
It has been irrefutably proven that the invasion of Soviet airspace by a South Korean airliner was a deliberate, carefully planned reconnaissance operation. It was controlled from the United States and Japan. The civil airplane was chosen for it deliberately, without regard to, and perhaps in anticipation of human casualties. Hence all the drastic consequences of this extraordinary incident, as they call it in the Western press.
But the Western world was already grumbling unhappily, and the tragedy was seen as the perfect excuse to show off NATO's military might in dangerously close proximity to the Soviet borders.
On November 2, 1983, NATO began a 10-day Able Archer command post exercise, practicing the alliance's actions in the event of an escalation of conflict leading to nuclear war. This was followed by the deployment of Pershing II ballistic missiles in Europe.
But it is the landing of a civilian aircraft on Red Square that can rightfully be considered the most epic case of air provocation. On the 28th of May in 1987, 18-year-old German Matthias Rust freely crossed the border of the USSR and landed his small plane on Vasilyevsky Sputsk. Once in the Soviet air defense area, he was mistaken for a friendly aircraft, as one of the regiments was having training flights at the time. 12 planes were in the sky simultaneously, and later on he was even confused with a flock of birds.
If I had asked anyone before the flight, do I have any chance, everyone would have said, no, the Russians will shoot you down immediately.
Matthias Rust was put on trial in September 1987. He was accused of illegally crossing the Soviet air border, violating international flight rules, and malicious hooliganism coupled with exceptional cynicism and impudence.
This provocation was followed by extensive personnel purges in the armed forces. Both the Minister of Defense and the commander of the country's air defense forces were dismissed, as well as about 34 more officers involved in it. Then some Western experts tried to compare this purge with Stalin's purges of military personnel in 1937.
And surely Belarus also became a target of air provocations, and no wonder with neighbors like these. In 2012, a private Swedish single-engine plane violated the Belarusian airspace. Subsequently, the pilots dropped a load of teddy bears. The provocation had been prepared for a year. There were 2 more Swedes in Belarus. one taking pictures of the airdrop from the ground, and the second was there in case the plane was shot down. In 2022 alone, Belarusian border guards recorded 363 drone flights along our borders. Almost weekly, drones are forcibly landed on hospitable Belarusian soil, and such reports, unfortunately, are no longer rare. Here's a recent one.
Pinsk-based border guards intercepted a Ukrainian drone. The incident occurred on February 8th near the state border in Stolin district. Belarusian border guards discovered a drone heading from the Ukrainian side to the rear of the Belarusian territory. The quadcopter was equipped with a built-in video camera. The content of the memory card confirms that the drone was launched from the territory of Ukraine and was used for reconnaissance and filming of technical border protection facilities on the territory of the Republic of Belarus. Last year, similar cases were recorded on December 1st, November 2nd, and 16th. After all, these drones are evidence that the collective West would like to drag the Republic of Belarus into some kind of a large-scale war to provoke some hardline retaliation that would allow it to criticize the country's leadership and the entire country in the media and naturally cause a negative backlash.
They purposefully and methodically probed the locations of Belarusian air defenses. In February 2022, a Latvian AN-2 plane violated the airspace. The aircraft flew 300 meters into the airspace, circled around the Urbanu checkpoint and then returned to Latvia. Earlier, the border was violated by Ukrainian pilots.
A Ukrainian Mi-8 military helicopter flying at an altitude of about 100 meters crossed the state border and flew up to 1 kilometer into the territory of Belarus.
As we can see, the air is and will be a zone of increased turbulence, and the more threats and aggression in the world, the more active provocations begin to become a weapon of hybrid warfare. This means that the Belarusian border will be further probed for vulnerabilities. It is necessary to be ready for air incidents day and night. History has proved it dozens of times. Goodbye.